Approximately 1 million people die by suicide each year, which translates to one death every 40 seconds. We know that the pathways to suicide are complex, involving a convergence of individual, social, and environmental factors, often combined with experiences of trauma and loss. Marginalized women, such as street-based sex workers or women who use drugs, experience elevated risk for suicide, including stigma, violence, social exclusion, and concurrent mental health and substance use issues. The criminalization of both sex work and drug use is a major barrier to accessing safe and non-judgmental health services. For example, women who are marginalized and criminalized are much less likely to access critical services and much more likely to distrust healthcare providers.
Just go.
Many marginalized women also report highly traumatic histories of violence or abuse, which is often associated with subsequent and repeated exposure to violence, as well as substance use issues. There are few evidence-based mental health or addiction interventions tailored to marginalized women, and therefore there's an urgent need to advance research and trauma-informed interventions. Next. I'll just tell you when to go next. All right, as all of you know, in recent years, research has found that both the medical and non-medical use of psychedelics may reduce key risk factors for suicide, such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as various addiction issues. A recent and large population study found that lifetime psychedelic use was associated with reduced psychological distress and suicidality, and this was among a sample of nearly 200,000 adults in the US. Canada has been and continues to be a world leader in the study of psychedelics. The word psychedelic was actually coined in Saskatchewan, Canada, by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in 1956. And just a couple of years ago, an article on the rise of psychedelic medicine made it to the cover of the Canadian Medical Association Journal. I also want to point out that much of the new wave of psychedelic research and psychedelic-assisted therapies have been among people of higher socioeconomic status. And many marginalized populations have not been included or been able to benefit. So an important part of the rationale for conducting this research is to help extend this work and potential therapeutic benefits to marginalized women. Last year, our team in Vancouver conducted a longitudinal study to see whether ever having used a psychedelic drug could have a protective effect on suicidality. And what we found was that other illicit drug use and childhood abuse increased the risk of suicide. But among women who had ever used a psychedelic in their lifetime, they had a 60% reduced risk of suicide. So this was a pretty significant finding and quite a large effect. So based on those findings, we wanted to further explore the association to see if psychedelics had any moderating effect on the relationship between other illicit drug use and suicide risk. So in other words, we wanted to see whether using psychedelics altered the effect of other drug use, for example, opioids, on suicidality. So data from our study were drawn from a community-based cohort of sex workers in Vancouver, known as Aisha, and this was between 2010 and 2017. Aisha consists of over 900 street and off-street sex workers across the city and is continuously monitored by a community advisory board. Aisha interviewers, as well as our outreach and nursing staff, are experiential, including both current and former sex workers. Eligibility criteria for the study included cis or trans women, 14 years of age or older, who have exchanged sex for money in the last 30 days. And participants completed interviewer-administered questionnaires at enrollment and every 6 months. So as with our previous study, the outcome of interest was having a first episode of suicidality, and this was defined as having thought about or attempted suicide in the last 6 months. We used a Cox regression analysis with interaction terms to examine the effects of using other illicit drugs on suicide risk among women who had used psychedelics versus women who had not used psychedelics. For the other drugs, we looked at use of heroin, crack cocaine, crystal meth, and prescription opioids. And the psychedelic drugs that were included in the analysis were LSD, psilocybin or magic mushrooms, and MDMA. Out of the 340 women included in the study, 16% reported a first episode of suicidality during follow-up. Indigenous women were highly overrepresented among women in this setting. Over 1/3 were Indigenous. More than 1/3 also reported recent physical or sexual abuse from clients or police, and over half of the women had experienced childhood abuse. Overall, just under 1/3 of participants reported ever using a psychedelic substance at baseline. So the table at the top here displays the unadjusted hazard ratios between drug use and suicide risk, stratified by whether or not women use psychedelics. As you can see, psychedelic use significantly reduced suicide risk by modifying the effect of using prescription opioids, as well as cocaine, which are highlighted in red. In other words, among women who had never used psychedelics, prescription opioid use was associated with a nearly 3 times greater hazard of suicide, whereas the risk was not significant among those who had used psychedelics. Cocaine was associated with a nearly 5 times greater hazard of suicidality compared to no risk among women who use psychedelics. In the final multivariable confounder model, the protective effect of psychedelic use remains significant among the women who used prescription opioids. So why might psychedelics be protective against suicide and moderate opioid use? Research indicates that psychedelics influence activity at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, which are also involved in major depression and suicide. There is some evidence that psychedelics induce neuroplastic changes in the brain. In fact, a study just came out demonstrating these effects with DMT, LSD, and MDMA. And the authors suggest that these compounds have potential for treating depression, PTSD, and addictions, which all share common neural circuits. Many people suffering from opioid use disorder in particular have overlapping PTSD. Psychedelics have also been shown to influence an area of the brain called the default mode network, which we've heard about earlier, and they are known to enhance recall of autobiographical memories, which may facilitate more positive reprocessing of traumatic experiences. Research also demonstrates that psychedelics have the potential to generate mystical type experiences, which we've also heard about, that can lead to profound changes in spirituality, life satisfaction, and connectedness. For example, a pilot study of psilocybin-assisted therapy for smoking cessation demonstrated that 67% of participants were abstinent at 1-year follow-up, and having a more intense mystical experience was significantly correlated with quitting smoking. There have also been some promising results from clinical trials on LSD therapy, as well as psilocybin-assisted therapy for treating alcohol use disorder. As many of you are aware, North America is experiencing an escalating opioid overdose crisis. Research on psychedelic-assisted therapy for opioid use disorder specifically remains limited, but there is some evidence from earlier clinical trials suggesting a promising role. For example, higher rates of abstinence were observed among participants receiving high-dose LSD and ketamine-assisted therapies for heroin addiction compared to controls at long-term follow-ups. Recently, a large population study among 44,000 individuals found that psychedelic use was associated with a 40% reduced risk of past-year opioid abuse. And ibogaine treatment has also been demonstrated to reduce opioid withdrawal symptoms and shows promise in treating severe opioid use disorders. So in conclusion, Psychedelics have potential to disrupt risk pathways to suicide by moderating the effect of other drug use. Specifically in our study, we found a significant protective effect among women who use prescription opioids. These findings come in the middle of the most severe drug overdose crisis in history, where there are large gaps in access to addiction treatments, especially for marginalized women. So there's a critical need for innovative and evidence-based responses to both suicide and the opioid crisis. And these approaches should acknowledge the role of trauma and other socio-structural contexts to effectively respond to the needs of individuals and communities. Overall, our study supports the need to advance research on psychedelic-assisted therapies to focus on how they may play a role in treating addictions and promoting mental wellness, including among marginalized populations. And I would just like to acknowledge all of the women who participated in the study, the Community Advisory Board, and the research support at the Gender and Sexual Health Initiative in Vancouver, as well as our funding support. And thanks again to the conference organizers for having me here today to present. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Come up here if you haven't.
Was this administered in a therapeutic framework and followed up, or is it just people who took?
So he's asking if we administered psychedelics in a therapeutic setting. This was an observational study, so we just simply asked the women if they had taken a psychedelic. So we didn't administer any of the psychedelics. So we were looking at the association of women who had taken psychedelics versus not, and what was that risk for suicide among women who used things like cocaine or prescription opioids. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Any questions?
Just to follow up to that, so this was an observational study, but we do have plans in Vancouver to be running some clinical trials starting up later on this year. And we'll specifically be using psilocybin for opioid use disorder. That will be our first pilot study.
I'm interested in your definition of marginalized. That could be pretty wide in this country.
Yes.
Yeah, can you tell us?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We use the term marginalized specifically to refer to women who are street-involved, such as street-involved sex workers, or women who use drugs. And in this specific study, all of the women were sex workers, either working in indoor venues or on the street. About 50% are working on the street. So yeah, it is sort of a broader term, and yeah, in this particular study, specific to sex workers. Thank you.
One more question.
How do you think people in other cities could collaborate to replicate the observational study or to transition to the next phase of studies with psilocybin assisted therapy?
Sorry, I can't see where you are. Can you raise your hand?
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Right here.
So yeah, wondering like how other cities that also, like people who also work with sex workers could potentially collaborate to replicate the studies in their respective cities.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it would depend on whether or not there's any studies that are asking these questions among these women, and if not, it would be a great thing to start up. So just start collecting data, putting together a survey and asking women about their experiences. Some important questions that we've recently added were asking women if they would be interested in receiving psychedelic-assisted therapy if they had any mental health or substance use issues. So yeah, it's a good place to just start collecting the data and raising awareness, I guess. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Elena.
Thanks, Mark.